So now we're going to take a look at how to lay out controls in your iOS application. I'm going to switch over here to this size inspector tab, and it's a little bit confusing. A lot of people get into this tab and they don't quite understand this top part, and this bottom part is even a bit confusing. But I'm going to try and explain this to you, and you'll find that the bottom part, this auto sizing, is really what you're going to use most often. So first let's look at this top part here. If I take a control, we'll just use a slider control, for example, in this case, and we look at it, I'm choosing either to show the frame rectangle or the layout rectangle. And this concept here is basically the difference between what the bounds are for the actual control and what it actually is going to be laid out as, or what the actual drawing of the control is. And to be honest with you, this is not going to be used very often. You can see when I switch between these that these values change just barely because they're very similar, the layout and then the frame rectangle. You can see that the frame rectangle is actually a little bit larger than the layout that it takes up as that width changes when I switch between the two. So you're probably not going to have to really deal with that very often, but it's good to know what it is. And the second thing here is this origin. And you can see as I click on the different origin locations that these numbers are changing the X and Y coordinates. And all this is basically allowing you to specify what the origin of your control is from inside the view. So essentially letting you say what these X and Y values mean. So by default the upper left hand corner is the origin, and this would be an offset in the X direction of 150 and in the Y direction of 35. And you can see if I move it to the bottom left hand corner, then these values change to reflect that. So normally you're not going to really have to deal with this. If you're programmatically dealing with this control, then perhaps you would do something with origin. If you wanted to, for example, translate this from some other coordinates that you already had in another application, or to make the coordinate system the same. But for the most part, again, this is not something you're likely to use very often. The next part is this whole auto sizing, and this is actually pretty interesting and is pretty useful, something that you are going to use a lot. There's a little example box here, and it really is the best way to figure out what is going to happen with your auto sizing. If we look at this box here, you can see this red dot, or this red box, represents your control, and then this white box that's being sized up and down represents the view that your control is in, or the container. And it's going to show you exactly what's going to happen with what setting you set here. So for example, I've got this control anchored in the top left corner. So as this container expands, it's not going to do anything. It's just going to stay here. Now if I got rid of this top anchor here, you can see now that the box is going up and down as the control resizes. And if I get rid of this anchor here, you can see that it's basically just staying in its same relative position in the control in the middle of the container. I could set a bottom one, lock it into the bottom right hand side, and you can see that this, if I do something nonsensical, it only takes what my last one was that made sense, and if I bound it all around, we're just getting this bottom left hand behavior. So that's for the anchoring on the side, and that's something that's pretty common in a lot of UI builders. If we look at this inner one, this is going to control the stretch, or the auto sizing. So for example, here I've clicked this to indicate that it's going to grow with the control. So this is going to grow relative to the size of its container. And so you can see here that if I move it up to the top, it's just growing in the one direction, in the horizontal direction. And if I were to choose the vertical direction, in this case this control doesn't grow in the vertical direction. So not every control, but a button certainly does. So you can see here that this button now is growing in both directions, or we could just make it grow in the horizontal, or we could just make it grow in the vertical. And again, we can lock which anchor point that it has. So this is very useful for sizing your control to make it auto size when it scales up, and this is going to happen sometimes when you're going up from a different resolution. This is something to take in consideration when you're going from iPhone to an iPad, is how will these controls scale up. So that's it for the layout and the auto sizing. Mostly you're going to use this bottom part here and this part just so you kind of know what this is. I like to go over it just so you're not wondering what these things do, because they're not. I don't think it's very apparent from just looking at this.